We are, as I've talked about, in the book of Mark. I'm going to start this with a phrase. I toyed with the idea of just shooting this out there, but I was like, nah, I think I might get the wrong impression. So I'm giving you fair warning before I say this. This isn't personal. Okay, here it goes. Who gave you the right? Who do you think you are? There. See, that could have completely set us on the wrong foot if I hadn't warned you first. Who do you think you are? These are pretty intense words, right? I mean, when do we, have you heard these words? Has someone said those words to you? Who do you think you are? Or what gives you the right? Have you said those words? Maybe so. These are typically pretty intense emotional words, right? What are they normally followed by? Something like this. Who gave you the right to tell me what to do? Or who gave you the right to judge me? Or who gave you the right to touch my stuff? I would hear that with my kids, right? Coming out of the bedroom. Something like that. Maybe not those exact words. Who said you could touch my stuff? Right? We've all heard that coming out of the kid's bedroom. Who said? It's almost always said in anger. And it is essentially the opening statement of our passage today. Who gave you the right? That's how we open it. Pretty intense. We're in Mark chapter 11, chapter 27. And as always, I got to give a little background first to make sure that we're all on the same page. So, let's just review. A few days before, Jesus came in on a donkey into Jerusalem. We discovered that that's actually kind of part of the Passover Lamb Parade. He was coming in, and yes, he was coming in victorious. He was coming in as king. They were singing Hosanna, but it's also the same day the Passover lamb would have been brought in from Bethany. And there was a lot of symbology there. And that was a couple days ago. Now, as of yesterday of this passage, the next day, Jesus comes from Bethany again. And on his way in, he sees a fig tree. There's no fruit on it. He curses it. The disciples heard him, and they're like, that's weird. Then they continue on to the temple, and Jesus throws tables around and shuts it all down. And there's all this business going on, and people bringing goods back and forth to the temple. And Jesus ends it all. It's a pretty big mess. It's a big deal. It's a fight. That was the next day. Now this morning, they're coming in from Bethany again. They come by the same fig tree. In one day, it's gone from green, leafy, totally healthy, dead like a doornail, dead, totally dead, to the roots dead. And Jesus has a talk with the disciples, and he doesn't really explain too much about the tree, except that it's obviously a symbol of judgment. And also we remembered that this is the only time, at least in Mark, that Jesus does a miracle of destruction. Every other time it's been of healing, or restoration, or calming the weather. But here we have Jesus doing a miracle that's very different. He's killing something. Not typical. Should cause us to wake up. Should cause us to click on. Because this hasn't happened before. And then he talks to the disciples and he says to them, have faith in God and you forgive. That's what's happened on the way to the temple. And now he gets to the temple, and that's what happens next. This is where we're at. Mark chapter 11, verse 27 is where we're going to start. I'm just going to read the first couple verses for now. 27 and 28. And they came again to Jerusalem, and as he was walking in the temple, the chief priests and scribes and the elders came to him, and they began saying to him, by what authority are you doing these things? Or who gave you this authority to do these things? Okay, Let me make sure you understand a few things. This is not some academic question like this. And by the way, Jesus, we were wondering by what authority you've been healing people. We'd like it. Oh, yes, I'd be happy to. No, this is a mob who was there yesterday. This is the people that gave permission to all the sellers to do what they were doing. This is the people who said, hey, can I set up a booth here? Yes, you may set up yours there. You can set yours there. Oh, no, you need to move a little bit. Hey, this is the people that organized, managed, and gave permission for all the stuff that Jesus threw out yesterday. They're the ones who've been fielding all the complaints. Hey, who is this guy? You don't realize how much money I've lost? I've got a business here. Who is this guy to toss us out? And they're complaining. They've been up all night fuming. They are waiting for this guy to show up so they can pounce. Who do you think you are? Notice it says or. It doesn't say or because the Bible isn't sure what they said. It says or because there were so many people talking, it's giving you some of the things they said. One person was saying, by what authority are you doing these things? And someone else was saying, who gave you the authority to do these things? It's a mob. They're all accusing him at the same time. They've crushed in on him. There he is, kunk. That's what's going on here. So it isn't, as much as we can answer the question about the authority of his teaching or miracles, and by the way, it'll all work, that isn't what they're upset about. They are specifically upset about the fact that he came into their temple and threw things around yesterday. This is very specific. This is how it starts. And this sermon is about the answer. I just preached through about 3 pages in about 5 minutes. Okay. Jesus' response comes in 2 pieces. And it's important that we understand that there's 2 pieces to his response so that we don't split them in half. So the first part of his response is going to be the one that we all associate pretty well. The second part of the response might be one that we have mistakenly set aside, but we shouldn't have. So here's the first part of Jesus' response. And here's where it starts. Verse 29, and Jesus said to them, I will ask you one question, and you answer me. And then I will tell you by what authority I do these things. Was the baptism of John from heaven or from men? Answer me. Now, why is Jesus answering this way? I mean, part of me really wants this. Part of me just wants Jesus to go, well, I'm the Son of God and the Messiah. This is my temple. I need to do what I say. That would be really satisfying to me as a reader, for him to just come out and say that. Why doesn't he say that, is the question. Well, here's why. If he said that right now, he would get arrested right now for blasphemy, and he would be on the cross tonight. Now, Jesus isn't ready to go to the cross. And when I say not ready, I don't mean it isn't as if he wasn't spiritually ready or not effectually ready. I'm not saying that if that had happened, his sacrifice would still have been sufficient. That's not what I mean. When I say he's not ready, I mean there's things he still plans to do before then. There's still events that need to take place. There's a plan, and he's following that plan, and today is not the day to go to the cross. And so instead of Jesus just saying to their face, well, as it turns out, I'm the Messiah, the Son of God, and you have to do what I say. That's why I was able to come into my house and kick you all out. He doesn't say it that way. So instead he comes back with this response. And what does this response reveal? Well, it's going to reveal their attitude about John. Why would that be important? Their attitude about John is important because John was a prophet sent by God specifically to announce the Messiah. Not only that, he was a prophet widely accepted as a prophet by everybody except them. In fact, we're going to see that in the text. So as we look into verse 31, here's the response from these religious leaders. After they've come in, yelling at Jesus, screaming at him, being mad at him, accusing him, and now Jesus is responding this way, and now they feel a little trapped. Verse 31, they begin reasoning among themselves, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why didn't you believe him? See, John proclaimed Jesus to be the Son of God. Verse 32, but shall we say from men? They were afraid. For the multitude all considered John to be a prophet indeed, and correctly so. He was a prophet indeed. So they answered Jesus and said, we don't know. And this is really, really telling. Think this through. Jesus is speaking to the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. These are the religious elite of God's chosen people. God chose them. He gave them instructions. He gave them a temple. He gave them all these different things. He gave them all this stuff so they can have communion with him. And the people that are responsible for holding up that relationship and being the conduit between the people and God back to the people, those people cannot recognize a true prophet. That's a problem. That's a problem. They can't recognize a true prophet, then they can't hear from God. In other words, they are not listening to God, period. If they were, they would have recognized God saying, this is my prophet John. It totally exposes the condition of their heart. It totally exposes where they are. They were the religious leaders. If anyone was going to recognize that there was a true prophet, it should have been them. In fact, it was their responsibility to recognize when there was a prophet, to stand that prophet up, to put their weight behind it, to tell the people and draw them to that prophet as necessary. They should have been fostering that prophet, protecting, grooming, holding together. They should have been drawing the people to God. The fact that they're willing to say, we don't know if that was a prophet from God, is damning. It's a serious problem. Amen. So Jesus' response is, well, then I won't tell you either. Now, here's the thing. He says, I won't tell you, and then he proceeds to tell them. But he proceeds to tell them in a form that they can't take him to jail for. He proceeds to tell them in a form that they can't legally hold them responsible for. So he's going to answer their question. He's going to answer it very specifically. In fact, he's going to answer way more than they asked. He's going to answer a lot more than they asked. But he's going to do it in his way that allows him to not go to jail today. So, we've got to understand that there is no gap between Mark chapter 11, verse 33, and Mark 12, verse 1. Just because it's a new chapter doesn't mean there's any space. It just means that's where the line went in the Bible. So when it says, and he began to speak to them in parables, this means he's talking to them. The religious leaders that just attacked him. The chief priests, the scribes, and them, that's who this parable is spoken directly to. This is their parable spoken to them. And he's about to answer the question of by what authority he's come here to do what he's going to do. And we cannot separate this parable from the rest of the scene or we'd completely mess this up. So here's the parable. Mark chapter 12, verse 1. And began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it and dug a vat under the wine press and built a tower and rented it out to the vine growers and went on a journey. And at the harvest time, he sent a slave to the vine growers in order to receive some of the produce from the vineyard from the vine growers. And they, that's the vine growers, they took him, that's the slave, and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. And again, he sent them another slave, and they wounded him in the head and they treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and that one they killed. And so with many others, beating some and killing others. And he had one more to send, a beloved son. He sent him last of all to them, saying, they will respect my son. But those vine growers said to one another, this is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him, and they killed him, and they threw him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers, and will give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The stone which the builders rejected, this became the chief cornerstone. This came about from the Lord, and it is marvelous in our eyes. Verse 12, and they were seeking to seize him. Yet they feared the multitude, for they understood that he spoke the parable against them. And so they left him and went away. You know, Jesus spoke some parables that the multitudes didn't get. This was not one of them. This was a parable where the audience figured out exactly what it meant when it was spoken. But just in case you're struggling, we'll break down some of the elements to make sure we understand all the bits of this parable and what they mean. We'll do that really quickly. Starting in verse 1. A man planted a vineyard and put a wall around it, dug a vat under it, blah, 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 etc., and rented it out. The man here is God. The assertion is this: God established Israel, not you. The chief priests and the elders and the scribes did not establish Israel. God established Israel. It's his country. It's his people. This is the man. And he did the work. And he established it. And he put the wall around it. And he dug under it to provide water. And he provided. It is God's provision. It is God's territory. It's God's property. That's the way it starts. But he rented it out to vine growers. So who are the vine growers? The vine growers are the religious authorities entrusted with the spiritual maturity and safeguarding of the people. That's the vine growers. So we have the man who has made the vineyard, that's God, and we have the vine growers to whom it has been entrusted, that's the spiritual leadership of Israel. And then we have this repeated story of servants being sent and abused. These are the various prophets that God has sent to Israel to speak to them, and the religious leaders feeling threatened by the prophets have treated them terribly. We know, for instance, that Jeremiah was beaten. We know from several parts of Chronicles that other prophets were killed. John the Baptist just had his head cut off. And while it wasn't the religious leaders that did it, they weren't saying anything either when he was taken into custody by Herod, who, by the way, Herod had a pretty tight relationship with the Sadducees and the chief priests. He appointed them. Then there wasn't any word at all from the temple about, hey, that's a prophet of God, watch what you do. There was silence. The blood of John the Baptist is on their hands. And so there's this repetitive theme of, again and again, God sent prophets to speak to them, and yet the religious leaders, rather than listening to God's voice, said, no, we're in charge, get out. We won't want to hear. And of course, we get to the identity of Jesus at the end, don't we? The very Son of God. And then in verse 10, as we talk about the stone which the builders rejected, that is from Psalm 118. It is a messianic psalm. Everyone knew it was a messianic psalm. Everyone listening to this that was a scribe, which is the people there, knew that Jesus was quoting, I am the Messiah. By using that context, by using that phrase, Jesus was saying, I'm the Messiah. I'm the Son of God. I'm the Messiah. That's why I had the authority to walk in yesterday and kick out all the garbage in the foyer, because I'm the Son of God. I'm the Messiah. This is my temple. That's my authority. the judgment embedded in this story because it's extremely important. And that's in verse 9. What will the owner of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the vine growers and will give the vineyard to someone else. This is how this relates to the tree that got killed, by the way. Jesus is specifically telling the people that he's speaking to, you are going to be destroyed by God. That is a pretty specific statement. You know, we've been talking about how this entire week has echoes or portions, things that relate to Passover. Remember I was talking during communion about Passover and how it started with a judgment. What kind of judgment? It started with God's prophet going into a temple where Pharaoh was a god and he was surrounded by his priests. And Moses walked into someone else's spiritual territory and pronounced judgment on their gods, judgment on their religion, judgment on all of it, and said, you're going to die. That's how Passover starts. Moses and Aaron walking in and doing that in their territory. And what is happening right here? Jesus is walking into their territory. He's walking into, well, their presumed territory. To religious leaders. People who feel that they have religious power. Who have set them up as spiritual authorities. And what he's saying to them is, you're going to die. God's going to destroy you. The message to Pharaoh and the message to these religious leaders is the same. There is a judgment here. There's a theme of judgment that's happening. Jesus is not just going to the cross this week and saving me. He is also judging an establishment. And he is pronouncing their destruction. Both of those things are happening this week. So, of course, they were seeking to seize him. Well, yeah, he just promised that God was going to destroy them. That's a pretty, and, you know, that's them's fighting words. That's what we say in America. They came demanding by what right Jesus invaded their territory. Jesus' response was, I am the Son of the living God, I am the Messiah, and God's going to destroy you and give everything you currently control to someone else. That was his response. But he did it in a story. So no one could do anything. He just told the story. How they interpret it was their business. So you've got to understand that this all goes together. This cleaning of the temple, the dead tree, the instructions to the disciples of how they're to handle it when God is judging. We talked about that last week. And now what's going on this week, it all goes together. It's all actually one large story arc. If you pull any of the parts out of that, you really kind of mess it up. It all goes together. And it highlights a key problem. These men were plenty religious, but they weren't godly. If they'd been godly, they would have recognized John the Baptist for who he was. And if they'd been godly, they would have recognized Jesus for who he was. But all they were really interested in was protecting their turf, running their system, maintaining their control, and enjoying their status. And in response to being challenged, their answer was basically, who are you to charge in here like you own the place? And of course, Jesus owned the place. So it was ironic. I'm going to talk now about some things that we might pull out of this. And first, at the risk of sounding super philosophical, this is actually a big question, and here it is. Where does right and wrong come from? Because this is actually a bit of what's going on here. The chief priests and the scribes and the elders, somehow they've come into a position where they think right and wrong comes from them. They come to a place that they can't recognize when God's trying to bring input into the scenario. They're depending on themselves, their own understanding of the law, their own understanding of what's going on, and somehow they've really got to twist around. Right and wrong comes from them. That's why they're challenging Jesus' authority. But it's also pretty much the essential world pushback against the Bible, isn't it? Against Christianity. Who are you, Christianity, Bible, God, whoever, to tell me what to do? To mess with my stuff? To judge me? That's the big one, isn't it? In the world today. Who are you, Christianity, to judge me? Because what is the world view, really? That right and wrong does come from me. It's called relative morality. And if that's too big of a word for you, it just means that morality, right and wrong, depends on how you feel. I'll give you some examples. Here's one. I hate it when that idiot drives too fast down my street. But when I break the speed limit, it's okay because I'm late or it's important. That's relative morality. It just depends on how I feel. Or when those millionaires cheat on their taxes, it really steams me up. But I'm happy to fudge my numbers just a little bit because why? Well, I'm too poor to pay all those taxes. When we change the rules to meet how we feel, and we decide that we're the ones who get to decide what right and wrong is based on what's convenient, that's relative morality. And it is the popular worldview of the time. It's what's led to something called postmodernism, which is basically the world system we live in today, and that gets pretty complicated. The answer to relative morality is God has the ultimate authority. The answer to relative morality is there is a right and a wrong, and it's not negotiable. In fact, that is the only answer to relative morality, is the idea that there is a source of truth that is immutable, that can't be changed, that doesn't come from us, that's external, that defines right and wrong in a way that can't be messed with. That's the only cure. But relative morality leads us to really weird stuff. Because you know what? You can defend almost any atrocity eventually. Really. I could get pretty gross. But there are people right now defending pedophilia using relative morality. And you know what? Based on the aspects of that philosophy, they have every right to do so. If relative morality is true, their defense actually works. And that's scary. It's scary that we belong to a world that subscribes to that kind of worldview when it can lead to those kind of arguments, and they make sense by those rules. It is a dangerous world that decides that right and wrong can be defined on what makes sense to me right now. When we start to discover where exactly that can lead us, it is very, very dark. I could talk a little bit more on that, but I'm not going to, and here's why. As much as I could take this passage and talk about that aspect of authority and where it comes to, and that it comes from Christ, that actually would be missing the exact point of this passage. And here's why I was a little slow to come to that exact point. The exact point of this passage has more to do against me than any other person in this room. The exact point of this passage is to religious leaders entrusted by God to take care of a flock. That is who the warning is towards, and that's who the judgment is towards. To be specific. We could generalize it, sure, but the truth of the matter is the people that the vineyard was rented to were the religious authorities given responsibility over Israel. So the warning of this passage, to the extent that you have any authority in the church, and it applies to you. If you work with kids, then to that level. Or if you work with music, then to that level. If you're an elder and a deacon, to that level. Or if you're the pastor, then the most level. But to the extent that God entrusts leaders with his vineyard, so to speak, and the question is, what are we doing with that? And so the truth of the matter is, this morning I have to talk this way a lot. This is a sermon at me. You get to be here to listen. Here's the problem. When church leaders start to put their own ideas, concepts, objectives, whatever, in front of what Jesus has commanded for the church, we're in danger of deserving this judgment. When we refuse to listen to godly people that God sends into our circle, and we get mad at them for criticizing us, and when we tell them, you have no right to judge me, you don't know what I'm going through, and God sends prophets, or godly people, or prayer warriors, or the old lady that comes and sits there and has a small criticism, and if we get angry and decide, no, you're not spiritual enough to judge me, and we don't listen to the people that God sends, and we treat them badly, we are in danger of deserving this judgment. When our arrogance causes us to read the Bible in a way that always affirms our opinion and never challenges us. See, so when I'm preparing for the week, do you realize how tempting it is to go, I already know what the truth is, I'll just go in here and find the proof. That's dangerous ground. If I don't come to this and get challenged myself and get corrected myself and get fixed myself and have to say sorry myself, I'm not doing it right. I'm the target of my sermon every week. This week, more so. It causes me to ask questions like this. Have I ever taken improper ownership of this vineyard? Do I ever forget who it really belongs to? Has God ever sent me a messenger only for me to turn them away without having really listened? And I was warned once, don't use a lot of I's in the sermon. Unfortunately, in this particular one, these are some questions I have to ask me this time. You know, we've lost some families over the last few years. And I've laid awake at night sometimes wondering what I was doing wrong. And I've been tempted to make changes just to make people happy. I have because you don't want people to leave and you don't want people to be upset and you don't want there to be discord and it hurts. I care about people. I actually care about people. Yeah, I hate it when we have disharmony. And it's not wrong if we make a change in the church and people happen to like it, but if I make a change in the church simply because people would like it, that's the wrong reason to ever make a change. We can't ever make a change in the church just because it would be popular. We can't ever make a change in the church because that's what people would enjoy or they would like that. That's never the reason. That's how the sellers ended up in the front of the temple. It's what people wanted. They wanted the convenience of being able to go there and buy their sacrifice. They wanted the convenience of being able to do that exchanging of the money. The sellers wanted to make that money. They wanted that prime real estate. It's what people wanted. It made them happy, and it was wrong. It didn't matter whether it made everybody happy. It was wrong. Somebody ever leaves this church because I didn't do what God asked me to do, then that's on me. But if someone leaves the church because I won't do what they want me to do, I can't own that. But it's hard. I'm just telling you. It's hard. The vine dressers, the religious leaders of the temple, were guilty of mistreating God's messengers, but they were also guilty of losing the path of even caring about what God wanted. They were guilty of allowing to come into the temple, to come into their environment, things that didn't belong there. They were guilty of making decisions based on what was popular instead of what was godly, because they were the ones ultimately responsible for what was happening in the courtyard. They were the ones ultimately responsible for who was allowed to buy and sell. It was on them. And they were guilty of allowing their position and their willingness and desire to make everyone happy to cloud their judgment and ability to be actual godly leaders. That ultimately is the challenge of this passage. And if I turn it into anything else, I am misusing it. That is the message of this passage. It is a condemnation of religious leaders for doing it wrong. The morning of this event, the disciples discovered a dead tree to the roots. And now in verse 9, Jesus extends that curse to the very men who attacked his rightful authority. People who are not bearing spiritual fruit. Oh, there was plenty of money. There was plenty of vibrance. There was plenty of economy to make the leaves look green, but there was no spiritual fruit at all. Just like the fig tree had been the day before. Green, leafy, looked healthy, no fruit. So Jesus answers the question of by what authority he does these things. And he says, by the right of my Father in heaven, and by the right that I am the promised Messiah, and by that authority I proclaim that you will be destroyed, and that what you currently take care of will be given to someone else. May we never be guilty of such poor stewardship. Look, I don't know where you are in your life, and I don't know how much you struggle with this idea of the authority in your life. And quite frankly, every single one of us, one time or the other, excuses our sin with some sort of relative morality of deciding it's okay in this circumstance because, and we come up with some excuse. That's a common problem. That's a problem everybody in this room faces. And if you need a wake-up call just right now to go, wait a minute, you have no right to do that. You have no right to excuse your sin. You have no right to come up with some flimsy answer about why it's okay this time. Jesus is the absolute authority. You don't get to pick. Yeah. But more importantly, and I have no idea what role any person in this room has in their church, we must remind ourselves as church leaders that the gift of being allowed to steward a vineyard or a body or a congregation or whatever you want to call it is a heavy burden with great responsibility. And that our ultimate objective must be to please God and not to please people. And that when we start to please people, we have earned the very judgment that Jesus pronounces here. And I don't want that. I don't want to be judged as a leader. I don't want our church to be given to someone else. I don't want this to become something popular but ungodly. Of what point is that? And so as we work together as a church, I simply ask that you would partner with me. One, would you pray for me? Because some days are hard. Some days are really hard. Would you pray for me that I would never walk one step away from listening to what the Word of God says, that I would never once bend and do something just because I was getting the pressure from someone because that's what they wanted. Would you please pray for me, because that some days is really tough. And to the extent that we are a small church, and if you're in this room, most of you are involved in some kind of leadership, it is on all of us to lead this way, to do it this way, to teach this way, to do whatever it is that we do this way. But the process is we got to find out what God wants. We've got to keep our ear open to the word that God is sending through his prophets or the people or the folks that he brings into our lives or the phone calls we have with our parents or whoever it is, whatever way that God's speaking to us. We've got to keep our ears open and not abuse the messages God's trying to share with us about the truth. We've got to stay ready to be fixed. Not by the opinions of people, but by the messages of God, particularly from the Word of God, from the Bible. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for standing with me, and I'm asking you to stand with me in your roles as leaders. This would be the way we would go about our business and we would not be guilty. this. Because God will pronounce judgment on that. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, as we look at our own lives, the truth of the matter is we all are a temple, and we have all taken over from you from time to time, and we've all made decisions about what is pleasant for us, but not godly for you. Lord, maybe there's money changers and dove sellers we need to kick out of our heart. Do we take right and wrong seriously enough, or do we make it up as we go? Based on what we think is right. It's a question we all have to ask ourselves over and over, Lord, and I know for myself it's a question that I have to admit I fail at from time to time. Lord, the big picture of what's happening in this passage is that Jesus came and he judged the temple, and he judged the religious leaders of his country, and he judged them harshly. He judged them for not recognizing your word when it came to them, and he judged them for allowing garbage in the temple because it made people happy. Lord, would you protect me very specifically as a leader? Would you surround me with people that can tell me the truth? That if I start to stray off, that they would pull me up hard. Would you surround me with people that also have dedicated themselves to doing what your word says, not what's popular? Would you help us to understand the dire response from heaven when we corrupt your design for the church, and we corrupt that with what makes people happy? Lord, if we start to stray down that path, would you whip us back? Whatever it takes. God, we thank you for this word, and we thank you for this scene, this entire environment, this passage where Jesus exhibits judgment. And would you constantly remind us that our role when you judge is to forgive? That our role when you judge is to have faith in God. Would you remind us our place and give you the authority to both define what is right and wrong and to judge as you see fit. For it is your place. You are king, not us. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.